Scott McLean from TranceMusicMastery.com, and in this video I'm going to play through a sketch project that I've created in cooperation with MyLoops.net, who's provided all of the samples used for this project. And I'll be playing through this sketch, and then I'll start a series of videos where I'll be walking through various parts, how I created it, and laid out the arrangement and the different drum samples that I'm using and how I have things organized, and just basically how I came up with this sketch. So let me go ahead and play it. Okay, so what I want to do is, in the remainder of this video, I'm going to go through the different drum tracks. So let me go ahead and solo those, and I'll just play through this middle part here prior to the break. Okay, and let's go through and walk through the kick. Now, I'll talk about the sidechain track when I get to the bass, which I'll do in the next video. But for now, we'll just start with the kick and then work through the drums. So for the kick, I'm using a sample called TCE305 kick. Now, that's the Trance Cosmos Elements 3. And this kick, if I solo this, all I have on this track is an EQ. I'm going to disable the EQ, and I am using a clip envelope. This is sort of an automation, one way to do automation in Ableton Live with a clip envelope, and I'm using this to cut off the tail of the kick, basically just to shorten it up a bit. So the kick lasts about an eighth, slightly more than an eighth, pretty much. Can't hear it once the volume levels gets down here in this region, but I'm going to let you hear that. So that's the original sample with no EQ, and the tail tightened up a little bit, shortened up a little bit with this clip envelope. Now what I'll do is go ahead and bring this up so that you can see how it sounds without any adjustment on the clip envelope. Sort of has some boominess to it on the tail there. And then I'm going to drag this down to where it was before, and you'll hear what effect this has. Just makes it a little snappier, a little bit tighter. So now let's look at what the EQ effect has on this sound of the kick. And what I'll do is I'll enable the EQ, and then I'll disable each node and then enable it one at a time so you can hear what effect each adjustment is having on the overall sound. So what I did first is just add a high-pass filter set for 40 Hertz just to roll off anything under 40. Left Q at 0.71. I think it's 0.707, but the display rounds it up to 7.71. And the next one, just to take out some of the boominess, just by adding a bell filter here with the frequency at 338 Hertz, 5.41 dB cut, just a gentle cut there. Fairly significant. I mean, it's close to 6 dB, so that's actually a fairly significant cut. And then you can hear the result. So now let's go to number 3. So again, 3 is a bell, and I use that to give a lift right at 66.8 Hertz. And then 4 really isn't being used at all. We're not applying any gain adjustment there. So it's really just the first 3 that are used for this kick sound. So let's take a listen. Alright, so next let's check out the hat. Now the hat loop is, I'll talk about the arrangement, like I've left the kick out here. I'll go through in the final video, I'll walk through and point out some specific interesting parts about the arrangement, how I have it set up. For the hat loop, this is the My Solid Drums 1, loop 138 BPM. This is loop 37. 037, and we can look at this loop here, and you can see that I've used another example here of the clip envelope. In fact, I'm applying it to the mixer track volume. You can also apply it to the clip volume. It just depends on what you want to do. One advantage of putting it on the clip is if you copy the clip, the envelope will go with it. But when I actually created this sketch, I ended up doing it on the track volume. Either way will result in the same type of sound. So now what we can do is I'll just play this. So you'll notice I've cut the volume of all the parts in this loop except for the open hi-hat hits on the offbeat. Okay, and you'll also notice that I've got this one set so that it lasts a little longer. Okay, it stays at a higher volume for a little longer period of time. So this first one is a little short compared to the last one. So let's listen to that. And that just gives it some variation to prevent it from getting too repetitive. Now, if we look at the effects on this guy, it's EQ8, and again, I'm using some EQ to basically just cut out a lot of the low end. We don't really need it on the hats, so we want to really be aggressive on that to the point where we only preserve the portion of the sound that's of interest when we're creating tracks. So for this one, I want it to sound like this. If I turn the EQ off, and it's actually a little difficult to do sort of an A-B comparison in this case because the level bringing that low end, more of the frequency spectrum is going to add to. Ideally, in order to do a A/B comparison like that, you're going to want to have equal loudness. But in this case, let me just disable this and you'll hear how this shapes up. So most of these aren't even really being used, like 1 and 2, so we can leave those off. 3 is a slight bump here, and 4, so really 3 is really only there to give a little bump right at 10.5 kilohertz. So let's hear how this sounds. In fact, we'll do 4 first because I want to cut out all that low end. Yeah, I would say 3 is not really making any difference at all. So for this particular sketch, really this is the curve that matters, basically. And all it's really doing is a gentle roll off of a high pass filter in effect, because it's cutting out a lot of the low end stuff here. Alright, so that takes care of the hat, number 1. And hat number 2. This is MSD1, My Solid Drums 1 loop. This is loop 3003. That again is a 138 BPM. My sketch project tempo is at 132 for more of a progressive feel. And this MSD1 loop has a clip envelope on it, adjusting the mixer track volume. And here I'm silencing the open hi-hat that's in this loop, and I'm only trying to pick up the closed hat hits that surround that, and then have that play along with hat 1. So if we listen to this one, and if I raise this volume, you hear the original sample. So I'm going to bring that back down. And for this one, the only effect that I'm using is auto filter. And that's really just primarily used for some automation that I'll explain later in the last video in the series, when I go through and talk about some of the automation that I've applied. So there's no EQ on this track, it's just this auto filter. Now if I play hat 1 and hat 2 together, and if I bring the kick in, okay, so the next track to go through is the snare, and one thing you'll notice is that I'm sending some of the snare to turn track C, which is the reverb, so I'll talk about that in a moment. Let me go ahead and play through this clip. This is the MSD1 loop 138 BPM 029. So yeah, if you look down here in the status window down here, you can see the full length or the full path to the sample, and toward the end there on the right it says MSD1 loop 138 BPM 029.wave. So that's the wave sample that I'm using here. And for this guy, I'm also applying some track volume automation via the clip envelope, and basically to kind of shape the overall sound of these snare hits. So let's listen to this. And I'm going to mute the reverb for a moment so you can just hear the sample. So you can see how I've got this clip envelope for the track volume, and it's going to cut off at the end of the sample before it loops around, so it has a much shorter decay than the first hit. So the first hit and second hit have varying lengths basically, and that adds some rhythmic variation. Okay, and if I play it with the kick, and if I play it with the hats, now let's look at the snare, the way we've got it set up for the EQ. And here what I'm using is, looks like 3 does make some adjustment there. You can see that curve, which is going to pick up some of the higher frequencies. 2 doesn't appear to have any effect. 0 dB gain reduction adjustment there, so 2 is not being used. So let me go ahead and just disable all of these, and then I'll bring them in one at a time. So the first thing I do is cut out a lot of that low end. I want a really bright snare. Then we'll bring 3 in, which gives a little lift to the 10 kilohertz area. And then finally 4, which will bring it back in and cut out some of the high. So it becomes less bright and has sort of a darker, it's dark, but it still has that bright high energy. So what I'm going to do now is just bring the reverb up. The reverb, I'm just using Ableton Live Reverb here. And I've got the reflection, all this pretty much up 6 dB, 6 dB, dry wet's at 100%. Anytime you have a return track, any effect on a return track where it has a dry wet mix, you're usually going to want to have that set to wet 100% because you're going to be sending from the dry track, basically, wherever the instrument track is, you're going to be sending the signal to this return track, and you don't want to double up on the dry, basically. If I had it at 50% here, I'm already getting a dry snare here on this track. By sending it here, then I'd be doubling up on that. I don't want to do that. So I just want the wet, I just want the effect. And then size all the way up, disable. I've disabled all of this, all the diffusion network, the input processing, basically disabled these modulation or filters on both the input and the diffusion network, and that's going to allow this reverb to be very bright. So now if I look at this and bring this back in, and I'll bring this all the way down, and I'll gradually bring up the send of the snare to -13. So for this sketch, I'm using a very, very long reverb decay time, 11.8 seconds. And as you'll see, I use that reverb on some other instruments as well. So that's it for the snare. Let's listen to what we have so far, the kick, hats, snare, and crash. Actually, that was the kick, hat, snare, and we haven't gone through the crash yet, so let's go through that now. So for this guy, I've got a filter, auto filter set up. Let me just play this. And let me turn the reverb off. Now, this crash, I'm not using any clip envelopes to modify the volume or anything. I'm just playing the sample as is. This sample is TCE303 crash. So that's from Trance Cosmos Elements 3. It's the same kit that I got the kick from. So for this guy, I'm just using the sample as is, except I am adding an auto filter on the crash. And the reason I'm doing that is to give a boost in the high frequency slightly with this filter, but then to modulate that cutoff frequency with the auto filter's LFO here by a slight amount. So let's listen to that with and without the filter. So here's the sample without the filter. I'll play it one more time without the filter. Okay, so now with the filter. In fact, let me mute all the effects here because we heard some delays in there as well. So that's with the filter, without the filter. And it may be hard to hear on your particular system. Let me go ahead. I'm going to exaggerate this amount just to make it more prominent. Okay, so you can hear that cutoff frequency going back and forth. Now I'm going to bring it back, basically hit undo a couple times here, bring it back to its previous value. And what this does, it gives us a slight movement back and forth between the left and right channels actually whenever you're dealing with that cutoff frequency modulation. It does add some movement in the stereo image. So with that, and if we look at, we've got a couple delays. We're sending the same amount, so the snare was set for -13 to the reverb. Same thing for the crash. So let's bring that in. So this is the crash with the reverb. And I've got two ping pong delays set up here. So on A, I've got a ping pong with a 2/16 duration, slight feedback. And then on B, this has a longer delay. It's a 4/16 or 1/4 duration, and longer feedback or more feedback, so 43%. And so let's listen to this crash with each individual ping pong delay. So here's ping pong A. And here's ping pong B. So you can hear those extra hits occurring on the quarter note. And then when you put all those together, the two ping pongs and the reverb, and then play the crash, fills up a bigger space. Now, one thing to point out on the master, I am using some limiting here. I'm using the Waves L3LL Ultra Stereo limiter, and I'll talk about that in the final video, how I have that configured, but that's mainly just used to get the overall level up on this sketch project so that it's up to closer to more of a commercial standard level. So now I'm going to play all the drums together real quick that we just went through. So this is the kick, hats, snare, and crash, and just play this one section. Okay, next I want to look at the reverse crash, and we can create that just by taking the crash sample that we used earlier and just click the reverse button here, and that will reverse the sample, and that's exactly how I created this reverse crash. So it's the same sample, just reversed, and what I'll do next is solo that, play through it. Okay, so that adds an interesting detail. I also have the auto filter here, but it's disabled, so it's not being used. And then I'm sending some amounts to the ping pong and reverb, different from the regular crash cymbal hit. So let's listen to that, each one individually, hear what effect that has. So here's the dry sample. Okay, here it is with ping pong A. So there's a little bit of a tail there as we hear those ping pong delay repeats occurring here, and it pretty much fades out right about here. So it lasts for about a bar for the bar 17 here. And then if we listen to ping pong B, and that's pretty much cleared out right around the third bar. There's a little bit there, but with all the other instruments playing, you won't be able to hear it. So it pretty much fades out after the second bar occurs from 17 to 19. And now if we listen to the reverb, the crash, so that again is lasting almost 4 bars, that reverb tail. So now when we play all three together for the reverse crash, and finally let's listen to all the drum parts now. And basically I'll play through this section of the track. Okay, that's it for this particular sketch for the drum parts, and what I'll do next in the next video is continue, and I'll be jumping down here and talking about the bass and walking you through the various bass sounds that I've programmed on Silent 1 and how I've laid out the parts. I will see you in the next video.